Hi there, this is Paula from Replicon. You might normally associate Replicon with timesheets, but we also support expense management. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up your Replicon system for managing expenses. I'll break things down into three parts: configuring global expense settings, setting up user-level expense settings, and assigning expense settings to users. These expense settings are defined at the global level, meaning they apply to all users. Expense codes define the types of expenses that can be used in your system, like airfare, hotel, or car rental. Replicon comes with some defaults in place, but you can add, delete, or edit codes from this list. Note that when project managers later set up projects, they can select which of these global level expense codes will be available for use with those projects. If you're using expense sheets with projects, that is. For each new expense code you add, you'll need to select whether the expense is a flat amount or a rated expense, like mileage. If it's a rated expense, you'll need to define the rate here. Notice for each expense code, you can set up one or more tax codes. Tax codes define how tax added to the expense code should be calculated. Tax codes are added on a separate setup page, here. When you add a code, you'll need to define a default formula for calculating tax, but you can customize this formula when you apply the tax code to an expense code. Expense codes include a field where you can enter the gross to net formula. This formula is used if employees record the gross amount, including taxes, in their expense sheets, but you need to know the net amount of each expense, excluding taxes. Something you might be wondering: do you need to set up tax codes and the gross to net formula? You only need to set up these fields if you want to see tax amounts isolated in your expense reports. So if employees enter pre-tax amounts, you would set up tax codes. If employees enter gross amounts that include tax, then you'd set up the gross to net formula. In either case, you'll see a tax amount for each expense in your expense reports. If you need help setting up tax-related formulas, search the Replicon help. When you have your expense and tax codes set up, there are just a couple more global settings to configure. One is payment methods, where you can define the payment options employees can select when they're recording their expenses, if you need this information. The expense columns page is important, since this is where you can enable and disable fields from showing up on employee expense sheets. So you could hide the payment methods if they're not used in your company. Note that if you disable the reimburse or bill client columns, these options will be set to yes for all expense sheets in reports. Finally, you might have to set up some options on the expense settings page. Due dates define when expense approvals are due. For example, you could require approvers to complete approval of expense sheets one day after sheets are submitted. If you'd like, you can create an expense notice that will appear on all expense sheets, something like expenses are due within a month. You can also create any expense custom fields you need that aren't available in Replicon by default. Finally, you'll need to ensure all currencies employees might use to record expenses are set up in your system, with their appropriate exchange rates. You'll assign certain settings directly to users in their user profiles. This keeps your system flexible, since it means you can assign different users, or different groups of users, different configurations of these options. These are the user-level settings you might need to configure for expense management. Expense templates define several expense settings for users, such as whether employees need to record all expenses against projects, whether they can override exchange rates or expense rates, or whether or not they can reopen expense sheets after they've submitted them. All users must be assigned an expense template because they grant users expense functionality. Approval paths define who approves expense sheets, and if there are multiple approvers assigned, the order of approval. Conditional rules are custom rules you include in these paths. like a rule that states only expenses over $100 need to be routed for approval. Conditional rules are only available to Expense Plus customers. Refer to Replicon Help if you need more information on approvals. You may also need to enable expense notifications, which are sent to approvers when expense sheets are waiting for approval or when approvals are due, and to employees when their expense sheets have been approved or rejected. Regarding permissions, expense end users don't need any special permissions to access expense functionality. They just need to be assigned an expense template. But you might need to configure expense approval permissions for supervisors or for project managers who will be approving expenses. You'll want to ensure they have the access they require, such as the ability to edit expenses. Note that project managers will only see expenses related to projects they manage. Now that you've set up all the expense-related items you need, you can assign settings to users in their user profiles. Anyone using expenses in Replicon will need a product that supports expense use and expense sheet notifications enabled. An end user or employee will also need an expense template and an expense approval path. An expense approver, which can be a supervisor or project manager, will need to be assigned a permission set with approver permissions enabled. That's about all you need to know about setting up expense management in Replicon. If you do have more questions, please visit www.replicon.com/help. Ask a question in our community or contact our support team. That's all from me for now. Thanks for your time.